There seems to be a bit of a roulette with a problem, reaction, solution, or a false flag in general, which is generally, did someone shout Allah Akbar, or did someone hear that? Was there a passport found, or was there a drill happening at the time? 9/11 sort of has the full shebang, particularly with war games and stuff.
Yeah, let's get into some of the things that happened on 9/11 then, apart from the buildings. How many people know that on 9/11 there was, and this is the word that was used to describe them, an unprecedented number of war game exercises going on in the 9/11 skies? Actually on 9/11, while the hijackings were happening, these exercises were practice sessions for the American military and Air Force to respond to hijackings. One of the scenarios was for a plane to have been flown into a building in Washington, the National Reconnaissance Office. And what was happening is on And as part of the war games, they were simulating planes on the screens that weren't actually there, but was just part of the simulation of the exercise. And so this completely and utterly confused the reaction by NORAD to these reports of the 9/11 plane hijackings. And in the book, I include some of the tapes of recordings of what these people were saying to each other. And when the 9/11 reports were coming in of the 9/11 planes, the NORAD staff, military, were saying things like, is this real, or is this exercise? One of the people involved said when the reports first came in, his reaction was, well, they've started the exercises early. And at one point, the simulated planes that didn't actually exist as part of the exercise had got so confusing to the reaction system that one of them shouts, "Get rid of the goddamn sim." But it wasn't got rid of until basically the 9/11 were over. Because it was there, the war games were there, actually on that day, and press was there to confuse the reaction process, to allow the attacks to happen without a military intervention. To give you an idea of what should have happened, in 1999 there was a golfer called Payne Stewart, and he took off in a private plane with some people, just going on a trip, I think it was to Dallas, and there was a decompression problem, and everyone basically blacked out. Everyone was unconscious on the plane. Immediately, air traffic control realized there was a problem. As the regulations demand, they contacted NORAD, and NORAD had planes up immediately. And other planes came up and tracked it across America on its trip, because it was flying itself. And they were waiting to see if it was going to fall, because it was going to run out of fuel eventually. They were waiting to see if it was going to fall under civilian area, and if it had been the chance of doing that, they would have blown it out of the sky. And if you look at the regulations, the Federal Aviation Administration, the Civilian Air Traffic Control Organization, it's very clear. If you lose contact with an aircraft or anything strange is happening with the aircraft you cannot explain, treat it as an emergency and start the process of contacting NORAD. In the entire, 2 hours that these attacks were going on, not one single reaction from the military happened that made any difference to the outcome of the events. The so-called plane that hit the Pentagon, Flight 77, flew 40 minutes into the Midwest from Dulles Airport, Washington. And according to the official story, turned round and flew back 40 minutes to hit the Pentagon. And in that whole period, there was no response from a NORAD reaction system that was up in the air in no time when a private jet from Payne Stewart's private jet was in trouble. In the previous year, before 9/11, 125 times, NORAD had reacted in the same way to problems reported with aircraft in America. On 9/11, absolutely nothing. For the first week, the official story was that no planes were scrambled in reaction to the hijackings. And then suddenly, after about 7 days, out of nowhere, CBS News, a guy called Dan Rather, reported, oh, yes, there was a reaction. Planes were scrambled from Cape Cod in Massachusetts to the attacks on the World Trade Center, and from Langley, Virginia, to the attack on the Pentagon. And then suddenly, the official story, which had been, well, no one was scrambled until the Pentagon was hit, suddenly was, oh yeah, we did. So that became the official story. Cape Cod is 153 miles from the World Trade Center. The Langley base is 130 miles from the Pentagon. Around just take the Washington as an example. Around Washington is a no-fly zone called P56. And if you enter, especially the inner part of that zone, then you must be transmitting a permission code. Otherwise, you're going to get shot out of the air if you get too close to the buildings of Washington, like the Pentagon, the White House, etc. And somehow this plane got into Washington, and the official story says hit the Pentagon. I quote in the book a former US Defense Secretary called Caspar Weinberger, who described the process. He said Washington is ringed with Air Force bases, and any plane that enters that no-fly zone without permission, without the code, is immediately met with a response from those air bases. And there are also, by the way, ground-to-air missile defense for the Pentagon, White House, and that area, which was not activated on 9/11. Why? 10 miles down the road from the Pentagon and the White House is the Andrews Air Force Base. This is where Air Force One, the president, flies in and out of. It's where foreign leaders come in and out of, where they're going to the White House. And it's 10 miles down the road. After the Pentagon was hit, and by the way, there is a big common theme here, in many, many areas, that nothing was done until the Pentagon was hit. Series of people, like Rumsfeld and others, absolutely lied. I show that they lied in the book, about where they were and what they were doing until the Pentagon was hit. Everyone was looking for a cover story of why they could do nothing until the Pentagon was hit, because it was being allowed to happen. After the Pentagon was hit, planes, it's reported in the mainstream papers, planes from the Andrews Air Force Base were scrambled to patrol the skies above Washington to protect from other attacks. And yet, the planes scrambled to react to the incoming Flight 77, as he's claimed, were scrambled from 130 miles away and never made it before the Pentagon was hit. Not only that, the pilots who were scrambled said they weren't told what they were scrambled for. We've already had, by that time, the World Trade Center towers, both of them hit. But they weren't told. So what they did is they flew into the Atlantic from Langley, because they thought they were being scrambled because of a threat coming from the Atlantic, which they always did during the Cold War. They said no one told them. As a result of that detour and other things I explained in the book, they never got there before the Pentagon was hit. And when you look at the normal reaction times of NORAD to hijackings, and then you look at the absolute non-response while the 9/11 hijackings were going on, it's obvious there was a stand down. And this is another example, and it goes on in every aspect of 9/11, of a principle described by a man called Fletcher Prouty. He was a guy who was an insider in the intelligence military community in America. He died just before 9/11, actually. And he was describing, he wrote books about the Kennedy assassination and who really did it. And he was describing what to look for in the case of an assassination. And in this sense, it applies absolutely to the events of 9/11. He said, if you want to get an idea of who was behind it, look at who had the power to call off the normal security precautions at the time that the event happens. Because he said, assassinations, terrorist attacks, don't just happen, they are allowed to happen by the normal response systems being stood down. And that's exactly what happened on 9/11. And in everywhere that you look, you find this non-reaction phenomena. And if the reaction had have been the normal one in the circumstances, a lot of people would still be alive today in America who are not. And this is who are not now. But this is another thing. We are told that these 19 hijackers were highly professional. You can find out the NORAD response procedure and the regulations that they follow on the frickin' internet. You only got to look at the story of Payne Stewart to see how they react when there's a problem in a plane, particularly if it's a likely or reported hijack. And yet, they hijack planes, it is claimed, flying from one airport, and then they hit buildings somewhere else. In the case of Flight 77, they fly it 40 minutes out into the Midwest, turn it round, and bring it all the way back again. Now, in the normal response procedures of NORAD, that would be impossible. They wouldn't get near Washington. But they did it anyway, these professional hijackers. Why? Because those who really did it, not 19 hijackers, as reported, knew there wasn't going to be any reaction. And when I talk about this common theme of nothing happening until the Pentagon was hit, and people producing cover stories to explain their non-reaction before the Pentagon was hit. I give you the story of a man called General Richard Myers, who on 9/11 was the acting head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon, the highest on the day uniformed military chief, and Donald Rumsfeld, the Defense Secretary. What were they doing on 9/11? Well, this is what they said. Remember, all these war games are going on in the skies. So when that's happening, unprecedented numbers of war games, people like Rumsfeld and Myers, they would be in the command center at the Pentagon overseeing it. No, apparently not. What Myers said, he said this in interviews on Army radio and in other situations, I quote him in the book. He said, what happened on 9/11? He said, I was on Capitol Hill having a meeting with a senator called Cleland, Max Cleland, about some hearings coming up. And he said, just before I went into the meeting, he said, someone said to me, a plane's hit the World Trade Center. So you are the acting head of the military at that day, at uniform level. What would you do? Would you contact the Pentagon and say, what the hell's going on with this plane? No, no. He said, I went into the meeting with Max Cleland, discussing something about some hearings on Capitol Hill coming up. He then said, I came out of the meeting and someone told me that another plane had hit the World Trade Center, and almost immediately after he came out of the meeting, someone said the Pentagon's been hit. So we're being asked to believe that this guy has heard about the first plane and gone into a routine meeting, not being told as the uniform head of the military that day that a second one has hit the World Trade Center, and when he came out, only then did he hear about the Pentagon. Note the common theme. He was not able to respond until the Pentagon was hit. Come back to him in a second. Donald Rumsfeld said that that morning he was sitting in his office at the Pentagon, next to the command center, and all the military chiefs around him in the offices. And he held a breakfast meeting, he said, and then he said someone came in and handed him a note which said that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. And he said this was his words, this is an interview with Larry King on then CNN. He said, about 15 minutes after he was given the note about the first plane hitting the World Trade Center, he said, I felt a jarring thing. And it was the Pentagon being hit. On the other side of the building, it's a massive building, as far from Rumsfeld as you can get. And by the way, that strike, whatever it is, and I say it wasn't Flight 77, and I explain why in the book, was actually targeted at something called Wedge 1, which was an area of the Pentagon that had just been reinforced specifically to resist an attack like that. And if you are, just as a quick aside, if you are wanting to create maximum mayhem as terrorists against the great Satan, as they would perceive it, then you are not going to park your plane into a place on the Pentagon which has just been reinforced specifically to defend against such an attack. You are going to strike the other side of the Pentagon, where all the military chiefs and Rumsfeld is. They didn't. Instead, they went past the Pentagon and did a miraculous spiral, according to the official story, to hit that wedge. Anyway, Rumsfeld, therefore, from what he said, we can break this down with a timeline. The Pentagon was struck about 9:38, 9:40. Go back 15 minutes, Rumsfeld's 15 minutes, and what, you're hitting about 20 past 9? He claims that, therefore, at around 20 past 9, someone's walked into his office and handed him a note to say a plane's hit the World Trade Center, which struck the World Trade Center at 8:45. And they never mentioned another plane that hit the World Trade Center at 3 minutes past 9. So, then in 2004, a man called Richard Clarke, who was the counter-terrorism advisor in the Bush administration, he published a book called Against All Enemies, I think it was called. And he described what he was doing that morning after he heard about the first plane hitting. He said he raced to the White House, and by about 10 minutes past 9, he had set up a teleconference between himself in the White House and the military chiefs in the Pentagon at the command center. And he describes in the book how, in this period, after 10 past 9, on the screen in front of him, in the command center of the Pentagon, is Donald Rumsfeld and General Richard Myers, who claimed to have been on Capitol Hill while it was all going on. Why would Rumsfeld lie about what happened to him on 9/11 when clearly he was in the command center all along, where you would expect him to be? And why would Myers lie about being on Capitol Hill when he was in the command center at the Pentagon all along? Because, again and again, whether it's Dick Cheney, all of them, there is this common theme of cover stories that turn out not to be true until the Pentagon was hit to explain why there was a non-reaction. And what was happening all through the system is the people at NORAD, a place called Rome in New York State, and an area of NORAD known as NEADS, the Northeast Air Defense Sector, who was the part of NORAD directly responding to the hijackings. They were completely scrambled in terms of information and simulated stuff on their screens and misinformation, so that they didn't know what the hell was going on. And other parts of the system were stood down so that there was no reaction until the attacks were complete, and then everything started to kick back in to what would normally happen. Because these attacks were allowed to happen because they were a problem-reaction solution to justify all that's followed right up to present day.